Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching. It was especially good outside. The sun was hardly scorching, and the wind, which came in gusts and brought clouds of fluffy, pearly gray clouds, pleasantly refreshed the bodies of the people, warmed by the summer heat. Young businessman Andrew Anderson was returning home from work. He was driving a large black business car driven by his faithful driver. "Kevin, please stop by the park. I feel like walking around a bit." The businessman lightly touched the driver's shoulder with his right hand, and the driver, glancing briefly at his boss in the rear-view mirror, habitually nodded. "Sure, Andrew Anderson. Let's just park somewhere near the entrance first. Looks like it might start raining soon." Andrew smiled softly to himself. He had realized that a long time ago he smelled ozone and wet earth in the air. When the car stopped, the man carefully got out of the car and immediately put down his cane for the blind. Despite the fact that he was always accompanied by the driver on such walks, Andrew preferred to feel the solid ground in front of him, and this cane became for him, in the last couple of months, something like a full extension of his hand. "It's beautiful, Kevin." The young man sniffed deeply at the humid air and looked up at the sky, his sightless eyes hidden behind the dark glasses of his sunglasses. "I wish I could see the color of the sky." "It's gray, Andrew Anderson," Kevin replied without much emotion, as it always is before it rains. Kevin, of late, not only acted as his chauffeur, but also helped him get around town. In fact, he became the businessman's guide. Since Andrew went blind, his other senses have intensified manifold. In many ways, this is what helped him to stay afloat and not to sink completely into the abyss of depression. The cause of the young, 30-year-old man's blindness was an accident that happened to him at a ski resort just 4 months ago. Andrew was skiing down a snow-covered slope at the time, and he fell on his back, trying to fit into a steep turn on the ski slope. It just so happened that the businessman's landing was extremely unfortunate. He hit his head right on a thick layer of trampled snow by athletes and hikers. The speed at which he was sliding down the slope was enough to cause Andrew a serious head injury that resulted in a loss of his eyesight. Doctors at the hospital later told him that the man could still regain his ability to see into the world around him through a complex operation. But it would take at least 6 months before it could happen. The swelling that had formed at the impact site had to be resolved, and for this, the heir to the fish empire Anderson began to take special medications regularly. Andrew remembered very well the moment when he woke up in the hospital room, and when he opened his eyes, all he saw in front of him was total darkness. At first, he didn't even realize what had happened to him, until he was completely convinced that he could no longer see. He put his hands to his face but saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. Neither light nor shadow. No more penetrated the retina of his eyes, plunging the man into a black abyss. "God," Andrew whispered then, "why is it so dark around here? Why can't I see any more?" It was a real shock for the young businessman. He had no idea how he would be able to continue running his business, and how he would live at all now. And although the doctor assured him that all was not lost yet, Andrew doubted it very much. He had heard stories about blind people who saved for years for the coveted operation, but in the end they never regained their sight. Of course, he had no problems with money, but all the same, the operation itself was too risky, and the businessman was afraid to even imagine what would happen if he remained blind after it. Andrew became sole owner of his father's company 3 years ago, catching and selling fish and seafood not only domestically, but also internationally. The boy's parents tragically died in a helicopter crash. This was the first and most terrible blow for Andrew, who at that time had only just begun to understand the intricacies of the family business, and was not at all ready to take on the role of manager. However, fate did not give him much choice. So Andrew had to urgently immerse himself in all the processes of the company, mastering them almost from scratch. Business for the young guy was not an easy matter. And because of its specifics, Anderson Jr. constantly had to be on business trips in small seaside towns, as well as in major port capitals. Fortunately, Michael Whitson, his father's deputy and an old family friend, helped him a lot here. The elderly businessman guided Andrew in everything and tried to tell him the best solution in certain business matters. Michael Whitson was one of the few people in the company whom Anderson Jr. could trust unconditionally. Over the years of working with his father, Whitson proved himself to be an absolutely trustworthy man, sincerely devoted to their common cause. At one point, the businessman caught himself thinking that he had forgotten what it was like to just relax and enjoy life, putting all doubts and worries aside. That's why he was so eager today to walk down the street and take a little peek in the park. The weather was too good for him and too much of a scratch on his soul. Unfortunately, blindness was not the only reason for Andrew's depression. In his personal life, the man also suffered a complete collapse, because of which his heart, all the time, was as if in a frozen state, unable to open towards a real and deep feeling. It had been 5 years since Andrew had been all alone. No wife, no fiancé for this tall and very handsome young man, whose sea-colored eyes had won the hearts of every girl Andrew had known, one way or another, before his injury. Anderson even tried to find his soulmate on a dating site. Incognito, of course. But all of this brought no results whatsoever. Those potential chosen ones whom the businessman had tried to meet before the accident saw in him only a purse on legs, a profitable match, a marriage. The other girls, on the other hand, were alienated by his emotional coldness and calculating nature, for Andrew, having received his inheritance, had to fend off numerous competitors who, after his father's death, intended to take over this lucrative fish business. So, Anderson Jr. had to some extent, harden emotionally, become tougher and more pragmatic. Only this, and also the ability to go over his head. Where it was necessary, allowed the young businessman not only to keep the family business afloat, but also to give it the status of one of the most successful in the country. The most interesting thing is that 5 years ago, Andrew had a real chance to tie his life to someone he truly loved. He had dated Lily for almost 6 months, and sincerely thought then that he had finally found his happiness. The girl worked as a simple waitress in an inexpensive roadside cafe and spent most of her time at work. Lily had a seriously ill mother who needed expensive medication. A young waitress had to work double shifts to take care of the person closest to her. Andrew wanted Lily to devote all her free time exclusively to him. In addition, he was jealous of her literally every visitor to the cafe, and this blind desire to bend his beloved to his will caused constant quarrels and misunderstandings between the couple. Only now, becoming older and wiser, the businessman realized that it was his short temper and authoritarian nature that caused them to break up. "Andrew, I'm not your thing." She threw it in Lily's face the last time they met. "If you don't stop acting like I have to be with you every minute, it's not going to work." "But I love you, and I want you to be by my side," the boy objected stubbornly. "Why is it that every time I ask you to come, you find 1,000 reasons not to?" Lily looked at him with indignation, as if she had explained all this to him 100 times already. "Andrew, I love you too, and I really want us to be together, but you understand my situation very well. Mom needs constant care, and I'm already at work all the time. I just can't be torn between you two, you know." At that time, Andrew was terribly offended with the girl, though he understood that she was right in many respects. His parents had never approved of her candidacy for the role of his bride and future spouse. They considered Lyra too simple and uneducated. They themselves dreamed of a much more profitable party for their son, some general's daughter, for example, or an heiress of a multi-million-dollar fortune, with whom their family could successfully become related. In one of the regular quarrels, Lily could not stand it. and told the guy everything that she thought of him. After that, the girl packed her bags and left with her mother to her hometown. Finally, she told Andrew not to look for her and not to call her anyway. She would not pick up the phone. The young businessman then flared up in response, and after saying a lot of nasty things to the girl, he assured her that he would not even think about taking an interest in what would happen to her next. After 3 months of mental anguish, the young businessman finally realized that he had made the most fatal mistake of his life, abandoning the only one with whom he felt truly happy, and in the company of whom could find the peace of mind and comfort which he had not experienced with anyone else since the separation of him and Lily. Andrew, of course, tried to fix it. He began calling Lyra several times a day, but the soulless mechanical voice of the operator on the other end of the line each time told him the same thing. The subscriber is out of network coverage. Andrew did not bother to ask for Lily's exact address, which he now incredibly regretted. The information services could not help him either. They could not find a person by his first and last name alone. It had been 5 years, but Andrew still sometimes saw Lily in his dreams. The man was terribly sorry that the only love of his life was now somewhere far away, living her own, quite possible, happy life, but without him. At the thought of it, Andrew's heart clenched painfully, because he was well aware that with his own hands he had destroyed his happiness. Now, after his injury and blindness, the young businessman felt terribly alone. He had no one with whom he could have a heart, to heart talk and just feel alive. Needed by someone, immersed in memories and guided by his driver, Andrew found himself in the park. The scents of blooming roses, wet grass, and approaching rain reigned. Altogether created the most amazing aromatic plume, which made the businessman involuntarily smile. Birds were singing everywhere, and Andrew felt a wonderful warmth in his heart. The young man had not felt so good for a long time. The park was sparsely populated, perhaps because it was a weekday, so Andrew could fully enjoy the sounds and smells of nature. Suddenly, not far from himself, the businessman heard the gentle voice of a girl who was addressing her child. "Be patient a little longer, Leo. I'm hungry too, but we can't go to the cafe yet. But the birds are eating the bread. I want some too. Let's ask Annie for some bread." The little boy, who, judging by his thin voice, was no more than 4 or 5 years old, said pitifully, "What is it, Kevin?" Andrew asked the driver. "Who's talking?" Kevin looked where the warden was pointing and saw a young woman and a little boy, obviously her son, sitting on a bench next to a large briar bush. The woman was dressed very poorly, in a sizeless tunic and a long, almost toe-length skirt. She was clutching an old rag bag, like the kind you carry vegetables in, and her dark blonde hair was braided into a simple braid. The boy, on the other hand, was dressed in shabby old cotton pants and a similar T-shirt, with Mickey Mouse faded from time and many washes on it. The beggar girl looked at the bread in the hands of the girl who was feeding the pigeons with such longing and sadness in her eyes that the driver's heart shrank with pity. "There's a woman and her baby," the driver replied to the rich man, and then stopped talking. At the sound of this beggar's voice, Andrew shuddered inside. Never before had he felt such a keen desire to approach and get acquainted with a girl. Her voice turned out to be very soft and pleasant, and caused in Andrew inexplicably a feeling of tenderness and warmth of the soul. However, more than anything else, Andrew was afraid of appearing intrusive and tactless. He was ashamed to walk up to her like that, with his sunglasses and cane. What would she think of him? Still, the desire to get to know the mistress of a pleasant voice overcame the shyness in the young businessman, and he approached the woman with the words, "Excuse me, I heard you talking just now. Is there anything I can help you with?" The woman looked at him strangely, and then, wiping away her tears, she said, "You? How can you help me when you can't see anything?" Andrew just smiled and replied politely, "I'm sure it's going to rain soon. Ever since I went blind, all my senses have been heightened. Including my sense of smell? The young mother smiled weakly and could only reply, "Yes, I've heard that. The body sort of compensates for some lost feelings by amplifying others, right?" "Right." The businessman nodded. "Would you and your son like to get in my car? It's right outside the park gate, and Kevin will take you." But a spark of doubt flashed in a woman's eyes. "In the car? No, thank you, I'm fine. Leo and I can find our own way." Andrew could tell by her voice that she was scared, so he tried to reassure her. "Don't be afraid, please. I'm not a madman or a maniac. I'm just a blind man who has no one left in his life with whom he can just have dinner." The young mother looked intently at the blind man, and then, just as slowly, transferred her gaze to his driver, who only nodded silently. "That is indeed so. Also, it seems to me that you and your son are in some difficult situation, so I want to help you," Andrew explained to her. "Please spend this evening with me. I assure you we will just have dinner without any hint of intimacy or anything indecent. After that, if you want, you can go straight home. Kevin will take you wherever you want to go." The woman hesitated for another minute, but then, from the gray, rainy sky, several large drops fell on her and the blind businessman at once. "It's raining," the baby exclaimed and held up his tiny hand to the sky. Well, right," the boy's mother finally said, shivering from the dampness and the wind. "But it'll just be dinner. Leo and I haven't eaten in almost 24 hours. I just want to feed my son." Andrew nodded, and the woman, who, as it turned out, was Lindsay, slowly followed her new acquaintance. Kevin, who had been walking beside the businessman the whole time, providentially opened a huge umbrella over her and the child. The driver noticed the longing and despair on Lindsay's face. She had agreed to this dinner out of desperation, because she saw no other way to feed herself and the child that day. When all three climbed into the car and it gently drove out onto the main road, Andrew ventured to ask the young mother, "Lindsay, forgive my curiosity. I don't mean to be indelicate, but what happened to you?" Andrew froze, expecting to hear in response complaints about his rogue ex-husband, or something like that. After a moment, a sad, deep sigh came to his ears. "What happened to us?" "Life," the woman said with sadness in her voice. "Leo and I just recently moved here. Before that, we lived in another smaller city. There wasn't much work there and they didn't pay much, so we wanted to start a new life with our son. Leo turned 4 this year, and I hope to place him in a kindergarten here and to get a job there myself as a nanny or a teacher. Kind of like I'm at work and my son is under supervision, you know." Andrew nodded. He patiently waited for the continuation and did not interrupt Lindsay. He wanted the woman to share her story with him to the end, except that it turns out that my diploma means nothing in the big city, has no value whatsoever. Lindsay continued, rubbing the hem of her sweater. Tears welled up in her eyes. "By the way, I worked in our town for almost 3 years as a kindergarten teacher, and none of the parents ever complained about me." Lindsay lowered her eyes. In her heart, she scolded herself for her own frankness. But something about this blind man gave her confidence. Andrew shook his head sympathetically. He knew very well how the frantic rhythm of the capital can break a person who is not ready for such increased emotional and physical stress. That's why many newcomers gave up so quickly, and at best, went back to the provinces, and at worst, yes, unfortunately, it's not easy to find a job here, the businessman said aloud. "How long have you been here?" Lindsay thought for a moment and then answered, 6 months or so. I tried to find another job after I was rejected from the kindergarten. I looked through all the ads I could find in the newspapers. I went to so many interviews, and all to no avail. The businessman's driver saw in the mirror that Lindsay's eyes were already wet. The woman was ready to cry from despair, but held back from the last effort. "I don't care. I'll wash the floors if I have to," said the young mother to Andrew, "but I'm worried about Leo. I can't save money to dress him like a human being and to feed him enough." Lindsay saw that the young businessman was sympathetic to her, and so, embarrassed as she was, she decided to share her problems with him. Looking at Andrew, who was concentrating on her, Lindsay quickly explained, About a month ago I was lucky enough to get a job as a dishwasher in an industrial canteen. Before that, my son and I had been living on loan with an old lady on the outskirts. I was taking care of her grandson, and she would let me stay with them. Their mother died a couple of months ago, and Margaret Hannigan was having a very hard time. Lindsay sighed heavily. I was set up at work a couple of days ago. My shift manager accused me of stealing. Allegedly, I had taken her purse out of her purse. But, of course, that wasn't true. She planted it on me herself, I'm sure. She threatened to put me in jail if I didn't have a small child. I ended up getting fired. Got off easy, she said. But now I don't have any money. So I've been wandering around all these days trying to figure out what to do next. I know that this woman was just jealous of me because the director of the canteen often praised me. So she could not stand it, apparently afraid of possible competition. Looking at Andrew, whose gaze was hidden from her by the impenetrable glasses, Lindsay was suddenly confused. Oh, forgive me for telling you all this like this. It's just that I've wanted to share it with someone for so long. In response, the businessman only reassured her. No, it's okay. I understand. Kevin, why don't you turn the car around? We'll stop at the mall on the way. Turning to his new acquaintance, the businessman said, We'll go to the store now, and you can buy anything you want for yourself and your son. We'll go to the grocery store, too. We have to buy groceries for dinner anyway. Andrew smiled, but he did not see the gratitude that shone in Lindsay's eyes. She couldn't believe that this man had agreed to help her and Leo so unselfishly. Thank you, she whispered softly, tears welling up in Lindsay's eyes. An hour later, Lindsay came out of the mall with several bulky bags of clothes and toys for Leo. The boy was bouncing along with his mother, happy as if he had fulfilled all of his deepest childhood dreams at once. Kevin was following Lindsay leisurely, his hands full of bags of all kinds of food and tea delicacies. Andrew wanted this dinner, which they would spend together with Lindsay and the baby, to be a memorable experience for both of them. For the young businessman, the whole situation with the woman and her child was a kind of game, a chance to distract from the gloomy thoughts and depression in which he was staying. Andrew thought that a simple human help would make him feel much better himself, and he was right. Though he did not see Lindsay's face, he understood by the contented sound of her voice and the boy's joyful laughter that he had managed to do something really necessary and pleasant for them. When all the purchases were put in the trunk and the whole trio was on its way to Andrew's country house, the businessman took the risk to make Lindsay an unusual proposal. Lindsay, you said that you lived somewhere in the suburbs and that you were having money problems. You could move in with me, at least for a while, until you find a new job and save enough money to rent an apartment. The young mother was not expecting this, so she felt awkward and embarrassed. No. It's so embarrassing. You've already helped us so much. Leo and me will only make you uncomfortable. We'll get in your way. In response, the blind businessman shook his head negatively. Not at all. On the contrary, I would be glad if at least someone else besides me lived in my house. You have no idea how much I miss living. Simple human communication. And you know, not many people go to visit a blind man. Lindsay smiled back and warmly thanked the businessman. However, when they arrived at Anderson's huge 3-story mansion, the young woman was speechless for a few moments. She could not imagine that people could live in such luxury. Do you really live in this castle all alone? Lindsay looked doubtfully at her benefactor. Andrew, walking past her, stopped and offered her to take him under his elbow like a real gentleman. Now, do you see what I mean? He asked with a slight smile. Lindsay nodded. She was pleasantly shocked by what she saw, but at the same time, a slight sadness touched her heart. Being alone in such a huge house, it was easy to go crazy with boredom. Once in the businessman's spacious kitchen, Lindsay was very surprised. There were so many dishes and all sorts of tools for cooking that it would be enough for an entire restaurant. "Didn't you say you lived alone?" the woman wondered. "Why do you need so many things?" "What about it?" Andrew answered her with a slight mischievous smile. "What if I need to urgently organize a buffet or a business lunch for my colleagues? Usually in such cases I call the chef here, and he already prepares everything I need." "And today?" Lindsay asked uncertainly. "Today, I plan to do everything myself." Lindsay looked at the blind businessman with a drop of skepticism in her eyes, but she dared not say anything aloud. Instead, she helped him sort out all the groceries and carefully sat down on one of the high chairs, watching as the man tried to prepare dinner for her and Leo himself. Andrew wanted to stew some chicken and vegetables and boil some rice, but cutting meat and cutting vegetables looked sloppy, even though he was quite good at it. This is because even though Anderson had managed to get to know his kitchen quite well, in normal life the man always ordered takeout. Here, however, Andrew really wanted to make a good impression on his guests, so he tried unsuccessfully to play the nimble cook. "Why don't I help you?" Lindsay suggested, unable to bear to watch her benefactor fiddling with the chicken carcass any longer. Realizing that he had overestimated his own strength and that he could not cope alone, Andrew accepted Lindsay's help. They cooked dinner, ate together, and then talked about different things over a cup of tea for a long time. These moments the blind businessman will remember for a lifetime, because he had never had such a heart-to-heart talk before that evening. For the first time in a long time, Andrew felt alive and needed by someone. At the end of dinner, Lindsay washed all the dishes herself, after which Andrew took her and Leo to a separate room. "Good night," the young woman said embarrassedly, accepting a set of fresh linens from the hands of the businessman. "Good night," the rich man said, then hesitated on the threshold of her room for a second before he added, "Thank you again, Lindsay, for agreeing to spend the evening with me. I know it seems strange to you, but you can't imagine how much you've helped me." Lindsay did not know how to react to such a recognition of the businessman, and therefore just lightly touched his hand and said, "We all just need a friend sometimes. I understand you, and thank you for taking me and my son in. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to us." They parted, and the woman put her son to bed, and herself lay down beside him on the wide, soft bed. When Lindsay woke the next morning, she stretched herself sweetly and cautiously climbed out from under the comforter. Leo slept serenely beside her, looking like a little angel. The young woman went to the mirror to tidy herself up, and at the same time decided to look around the room, because the day before, in the half-light from the soft and diffused light of the wall sconce, she had not had time to appreciate it. The room Andrew gave them to live in wasn't very big, but it was very comfortable. The high window let in plenty of light and made the surroundings even friendlier. Lindsay turned around to wake her son, and at that moment she awkwardly elbowed the stack of beautifully decorated photo albums on the miniature coffee table. The albums rattled to the floor, and most of the pictures spilled out in a swirl of color. Lindsay cringed and immediately squatted down, trying to put everything back together. At that moment, Lindsay's eyes caught on one picture. The young woman took the picture in her hands and looked at it closely. The picture was of a very beautiful young girl of about 23 to 25 years old. Her beautiful brown hair flowed in a waterfall over her thin shoulders, and her clear blue eyes looked at Lindsay calmly and with dignity. Leo's mother slowly settled down on the soft carpet and clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming out loud. "Ashley," Lindsay said in a half-whisper. "Ashley, how could you?" The shock the young woman experienced was due to the fact that Lindsay was looking at her own sister, who had died 4 years earlier. Lindsay couldn't hold back her tears and cried softly as she realized only now that the businessman who had taken her and Leo in was the man who was directly responsible for Ashley's death. Then, 4 years earlier, Lindsay's sister had died in labor, giving birth to little Leo. She'd been pregnant by a rich man, She'd told her sister at the time how the bastard had left her in such a delicate position. Of course, Ashley had decided to have the baby. It wasn't the baby's fault that his father was such a scoundrel. Lindsay had never seen her sister's boyfriend's face, but she always remembered his name. And his name was Andrew. The young mother carefully analyzed everything again. The age, the name, this picture. There could be no doubt. Apparently, she and Ashley had met before the millionaire went blind, and he probably does not remember that he once had an affair with this girl. After Ashley's death, her sister immediately filed for custody and adopted the deceased son. All these 4 years, Lindsay had passed Leo off as her own child, and in fact it was because the boy had no memory of his mother, and Lindsay had loved her little nephew more than life itself, and had long considered him her own son. Lindsay didn't know what to do now. On the one hand, she should ask the businessman directly about everything, find out why he had been so mean to her sister. But on the other hand, Andrew was very weak now, and also mentally broken because of his blindness. What kind of person would she be in his eyes if she started to cut him alive right now? In the end, Lindsay decided not to say anything for the time being. When he was stronger, and then we would see. Of course, the woman felt immensely sorry for her dead sister, but she didn't want to take revenge on Andrew, because she didn't think it was right. What happened was what happened was what happened, and she was powerless to change anything. Lindsay stayed at Andrew's house for 2 more months. During that time, the young businessman had become very attached to her and her son. Leo didn't understand why Uncle Andrew always wore sunglasses, but that didn't stop them from playing cowboys and Indians. In the living room on the soft Persian rug, the young businessman took care of Lindsay and Leo with great pleasure. It was a real joy for him to come home in the evenings and to hear the happy laughter of the baby. Lindsay cooked homemade food for the baby. Lindsay cooked homemade food, and in the culinary part, the woman was a real magician. So very soon the blind rich man forgot what home delivery was. Shortly thereafter, Andrew underwent the vision restoration surgery that he had feared at the beginning of his treatment. He really wanted to see with his own eyes the girl and the baby, which literally gave him a second life. However, the man was worried in vain. The operation was successful, and in a couple of weeks Andrew was bandaged. When he slowly opened his eyes, his heart was beating as hard as if it were about to jump out of his chest. He had seen, even though it was still bad, and the images before his eyes were a bit blurry, but he saw light shadow colors. All of it came back into his life, though the man himself had even gotten used to the role of the blind man and thought he could never be the same again. At the same time, Lindsay agonized terribly, knowing the truth and not being able to tell it to her benefactor, who had so quietly transformed her and her son into a faithful friend and protector. Still, the desire for justice prevailed in Lindsay. Frightened, she brought a picture of her sister into the room and began a difficult conversation with Andrew. Andrew, I know this must be very hard for you to know right now, but I think Leo is your son. To say that the businessman was shocked is to say nothing. He was very happy to see Lindsay in front of him. Even in blurred focus, she seemed very beautiful. But the news made him dizzy. What makes you say that, Lindsay? The businessman stared at her in amazement. The young woman timidly handed him a photo of her sister. Here. That's Ashley, my little sister. This picture fell out of your album the first morning after we moved in. Please tell me, don't lie to me. Were you too close? Andrew took the picture in his hands, though he could still see everything in blurry focus. But he knew from the general outline who it was. No, Lindsay, I've never met this girl. Honestly, Lindsay was stunned. For a split second, she even forgot how to breathe. What do you mean you've never seen each other? The former teacher asked him again. Are you sure? Absolutely. The businessman nodded. Ashley and I did meet once, but only in virtual reality. We corresponded on a dating site, he explained. Lindsay continued to stare at him in amazement. You see, we never got to see each other in person, Andrew explained to her. She sent me a picture of herself, and I even printed it out and framed it. For a long time it was on my desk. I really liked your sister, but somehow she disappeared abruptly. Just one beautiful day she stopped contacting me. Lindsay didn't understand. How could it be? After all, the name and even the age fit. You mean you haven't had a single date? The woman asked in a faint voice. No, the businessman said with a smile. But Lindsay explained to me why you thought I was your nephew's father. Lindsay looked at her friend and benefactor, and tears gushed from her eyes. The young mother told him the whole story of her sister, and concluded with a bitter tone of voice. That bastard Andrew, your namesake. He hasn't even called once since then, hasn't asked how his ex-fiancée is, how his kid is. He threw them out like used things, and that was it. And Ashley's gone, and Leo and I are all alone in the world. No help or support. Our parents had died a long time ago, so Ashley and I had been trying to hold on to each other all our lives, knowing we could only rely on ourselves. Thus, Lindsay learned that Andrew Anderson and her deceased sister were only acquaintances, but not lovers, and the businessman from the capital was not the father of her adopted son. After what had happened, Lindsay was very ashamed of herself and of the fact that she could think so badly of Andrew. The young woman wanted to leave the millionaire's mansion, but the businessman managed to persuade her to stay at least for a couple more weeks. Well, where will you go now? Andrew told her, smiling with happiness that he could see Lindsay and her adorable little boy. Besides, I'm not chasing you. On the contrary, it makes me happy to have you by my side. Lindsay looked into his stunning sea-wave-colored eyes and blushed like a schoolgirl. No, Andrew. You've already got us overstaying our welcome. But why? Were you really that upset about that conversation about your sister? Looking intently at her, the businessman asked. Lindsay's eyes were downcast, unable to hide her feelings. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I hurt you. I can't imagine how you felt at that moment. Andrew gently took Lindsay by the chin and forced him to look at him. Lindsay, it doesn't really matter. The man took a deep breath before he continued. Do you think if I were really Leo's father, I'd leave him? You're the only thing I live for now. You can't imagine the unspeakable happiness I feel every time I look at you. I need you, Lindsay, so does Leo. Lindsay looked at the young businessman, unable to believe what she heard. And Andrew, meanwhile, told her the absolute truth. Only now he finally understood what a real family understood. What a real family, home comfort, and that magical feeling when you come home tired. And they are waiting for you there. The businessman did not want to lose it all, especially since his feelings for Lindsay had long ago become much deeper than a simple friendship. The young single mother aroused in Andrew's heart a real storm of emotions, which he did not dare to show for fear of scaring off the timid and modest Lindsay. Andrew, I don't understand. With difficulty in choosing words, the man finally spoke. Lindsay, can I ask you out on a date? I mean, a real date. I'd love to take you to theater, or at least to the movies. Andrew froze, wondering if he was being too emotional with her. But Lindsay looked at him with the tenderness that only a real serious feeling can give a woman. Let's start with a movie, if you don't mind, Lindsay said slowly and gave him a nice, bright smile. From that moment, Andrew and Lindsay began to develop mutual warm feelings. In fact, the businessman liked the former teacher immediately, but she did not believe that a man like him would pay attention to her, a simple woman from the provinces. The couple began to go together to the theater, to the opera, to cultural exhibitions and festivals, which were always abundant in the capital. Andrew gave Lindsay flowers and felt how with each passing day they were becoming dearer and closer to each other. After a few months of a tender and reverent relationship, the businessman made Lindsay a formal proposal, and she happily agreed to become his wife. After a wonderful wedding, Andrew immediately filed papers to adopt Leo and gave the boy his last name. The boy is happy now that he has a real daddy, such a wonderful one as Andrew. Lindsay became a full-fledged keeper of the family home and a devoted wife to Andrew. Their love was very strong, and nothing could destroy it. 3 months after the wedding, the young woman pleased her husband with the joyful news. He would become a father again, only this time for their common with Lindsay child, whom she carried under her heart. 9 months later, she gave birth to her husband's beautiful daughter, whom she and Andrew named Allison. Thus, the Anderson family became one of the happiest, having gone through all trials and realizing that understanding and love are much more important than money and social status. Each of them, Andrew and Lindsay, has found in this relationship exactly what they have been looking for so long. They have long and happy years ahead of them, filled with comfort, care. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.